This is the heart of the Teutoburgerwald, a relaxing and peaceful forest near Hanover in northern Germany. I'm Matthew Settle. In 9 AD, this place was anything but peaceful. It was a battleground where 18,000 Roman soldiers, led by their commander Varus, were ambushed by thousands of German tribesmen, led by the former Roman soldier Arminius. For 3 days, Varus would try to fight his way out of a death trap.
Now, with new video game technology, you are about to see this great battle as never before.
The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. Get the view the generals wish they had, now on Decisive Battles.
In 9 AD, Rome was a confident imperial power, and it had reason to be. The Emperor Augustus had ruled for 36 years. During this time, he had reformed the army, brought the legions under his sole control, and expanded the borders of the empire. The Romans had never had it so good.
This is a sense of power unlimited and Rome's right to rule. So there's tremendous confidence. The gods are on Rome's side.
Augustus was the great-nephew of Julius Caesar. He believed that he was descended from the god Apollo and had a month of the year, August, named after him.
But if he was a god, he was certainly in disguise. He was short, he walked with a limp, and at the age of 72, he could only see out of one eye. But with that one eye, he had a great vision for his empire.
He had expanded Rome's boundaries to guard against external attack. He was particularly proud of how the tribes who lived out on the frontier had been colonized and adopted Roman practices. This even seemed to be working well in one of the wildest parts of the empire, Germania, modern-day Germany. New towns were being built. Mainz, Cologne, and Bonn were all Roman garrison towns. They were all west of the River Rhine. East of the River Rhine was a different story. The land between the Rhine and the Elbe had always been dangerous territory. The young Roman commander Drusus had fought against the German tribes there 20 years earlier and had pushed east as far as the Elbe before he fell off his horse and died at the age of 29. But by the time of his death, he had managed to pacify the region. The time had now come to Romanize these tribal lands.
In 7 AD, Augustus Caesar appointed Quintilius Varus as governor of Germania. His job was to set up administrative systems in the Rhineland and turn it into a proper Roman province. Varus had an eventful family history. Both his father and his grandfather had committed suicide after political failure. But Varus had no intention of continuing his family tradition.
Varus was brought in from the east. He had been a governor of Syria. It was said by one of the ancient sources that Varus was a crook. Varus, when he went to Syria, was poor and Syria was rich. And when he left, Varus was rich and Syria was poor.
But Varus was an administrator, not a battlefield commander.
He thought that the German people had advanced so far along the process of provincialization that they were eager to learn how to work with Roman law and Roman principles of government.
After arriving in Germania, he tried to set up a taxation system in the tribal areas and established good relations with the local leaders. The most prominent of these was Arminius. His lands lay midway between the Rhine and the Elbe. Arminius already seemed Roman in all but name. He was around 25 years old and had spent his adult life in the Roman army. He had served as an officer in the auxiliaries. Auxiliary soldiers were recruited from the provinces and frontier regions. They served in units of 500 men and were commanded by their own local leaders. Their job was to back up the legions. Arminius was a very able commander. He learned Latin and was made a Roman citizen as a reward for his success on the battlefield.
To Varus, the Romanized tribesman, was an example of what could be achieved in the region. The two became firm friends and ate in the officers' mess.
Arminius is a man with a foot in both camps. Figures such as Arminius, who can both relate to the local native population and the Roman authorities, are crucial to the whole project of the Roman Empire.
But behind the smiles, the reality was completely different. Most of the tribes feared that Varus would force them to pay heavy taxes to Rome, instead of the goodwill gifts or tribute they normally sent to the emperor.
It looks as though, from Varus right up to the imperial throne, there was an expectation that Germany was now ready to be made into an ordinary province. They were ready to pay their taxes like everybody else, and they miscalculated.
And the tribal leaders feared that if their lands became part of a Roman province, they would lose all their power and influence.
Political independence, which had existed as a client state, was begone forever. And that was a hard pill to swallow for the leaders unless they had some really clear guarantees that they were going to be employed in this new provincial regime.
Arminius knew they were right. During his years in the army, he had seen the iron grip of Roman government. Varus would have to be stopped.
He was the leader of the resistance movement, and he certainly knew enough about Roman society, and especially the Roman army, to really know what he was resisting.
He was around Varus's camp, and when others told Varus not to trust him, not to believe him, that he might be a traitor, Varus said, "He's my friend." And he believed it.
He's overconfident, essentially. He doesn't really recognise the scale of the threat he's got against him, and he chooses to trust the wrong people with feet in both camps.
In September 9 AD, word arrived of a tribal uprising, several days' march away. Varus immediately set out to suppress it. He took 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and German auxiliaries led by his trusted ally, Arminius. Their route lay through the deep Teutoburg forest. Arminius's moment had arrived. Varus was about to find out who his true friends really were.
It is 9 AD. The Roman army in Germany is on the march to suppress a tribal revolt. At stake, the eastward expansion of the empire.
Varus was leading an army of 18,000 men and a heavy baggage train with scores of wagons. The officers' baggage even included large wooden beds for comfort. The 3 legions were among Rome's finest and were Augustus's pride and joy.
Augustus was to refer to military campaigns as fishing with a golden hook. That is to say, you really are taking sometimes a risk with one of your greatest assets, your military manpower.
The Romans feared the forest as a wild and uncivilized place. They believed that the great oak forest of the north marked the edge of the world.
100 years later than the events we're discussing, Tacitus, writing his Germania, talks about semi-mythical, part human, part animal figures. So there are areas deep in the interior of Germany which are almost perceived as mythical to the Roman elite.
For the German tribes, the forest trees often marked sacred places. The Christmas tree we bring into our home each year as a reminder of those beliefs.
As the Romans entered the forest, they were forced to abandon their normal marching formation. Instead, they formed a long, winding column over 2 miles long. A cavalry detachment led the way. Varus and his entourage traveled midway down the column. At this point, Arminius came to Varus and offered to take his men off and gather up more allies for the battle ahead. Varus thought about it and agreed. And Arminius and his men melted away into the forest.
That's a normal thing for someone who's on the Roman side to do. Absolutely normal. And given that Varus trusts Arminius, it's no surprise that he allows him to do that. Arminius, of course, is doing something quite different. He's taking himself away to rally forces that are going to turn against their Roman allies.
The Roman column moved on nervously. Experienced centurions peered into the dark and gloomy forest, but Varus felt secure.
He's also basically seeing this as an exercise in moving through a largely pacified landscape, and that's a dreadful mistake to make.
Arminius was a really capable commander. Varus was kind of a bumbler, but probably his greatest weakness was he didn't know he was a bumbler. He didn't accept advice.
The Romans were now confined to a narrow forest path with a steep hill on one side and a swamp on the other. To make matters worse, the weather turned nasty, with heavy rain and strong winds.
They couldn't deploy in battle line. They couldn't station cavalry on the flanks to protect the infantry from counterattack on the sides, flanking motions. It was a tremendously bad place for the Romans to fight.
Suddenly, hundreds of arrows and javelins began to fly from the trees, thudding into the front of the Roman column. Hidden among the trees were the nearly 18,000 German tribesmen. The Romans were in disarray. They knew how to change formation in the face of an attack like this, but there was just no room. Soldiers collided with one another as they ran for safety. But when the Romans tried to get away through the trees, they found that the Germans had filled the gaps between the trunks with earth. Construction work that must have taken weeks.
What we see is just how much other planning went into this. This has taken a lot of thought. How do you break the army up? And then, once you've got them in some of the least favourable land, how do you capitalise on that?
It probably took a couple of minutes for news of what had happened to get back to Varus.
Communication must have been quite difficult along the line of the column, so terrible things could be happening in one place and the others wouldn't really know much about it. They may hear muffled screams from afar, but they wouldn't necessarily know what was going on.
Now the remainder of the German army swarmed out of the forest from both sides of the track. A volley of spears was followed by close combat with swords.
It was probably never possible to come together in legionary strength because of the nature of the battlefield, which was chosen entirely by Arminius.
Varus had been caught in the perfect ambush. He saw the shocking reality behind the slaughter. He'd been betrayed by a man he was proud to call a friend.
Arminius knew from his own army experience that it would be suicide to fight the Romans on an open battlefield. Most of his army were spearmen who would not have stood a chance against disciplined formations. Now he had the legions at his mercy in his own backyard. After the first assault, the Germans ran back into the forest. Varus fell back the way he had come, and the army established a series of camps by nightfall. But the next day it was still wet and windy, and the attacks began again.
The weather was pretty desperate. Wind, rain would have made not simply keeping troops together, I think, quite difficult, but also meant that using weapons was difficult, rather difficult to use your slings and your bows in those sorts of conditions.
The rain made it difficult for the Romans to come together in a military unit to defend themselves. The rain made it impossible for them to use their bows. The rain made throwing spears useless.
Arminius aimed to break the Roman line at a number of points, cut the Roman army into sections, and then finish them off, one at a time. Groups of troops tried to make a break for it, but were easily cut down as they ran off the track and into the swamp.
The Romans fought in the rain, they fought in the sunshine, but no one can fight in the peat bog.
Even allowing for the element of surprise, why were the heavily armed Romans unable to put up more of a struggle against their lightly armed attackers? The answer may have been that Arminius equipped a section of his army with Roman weapons. No Germanic weapons were ever found on this battle site.
Defeat was unthinkable for Varus. He was trapped in the depths of the forest with 3 of the Emperor's treasured legions. Augustus's dream of ever-expanding frontiers, of empire without end, had turned into a bloody nightmare.
It is 9 AD. A Roman army of 18,000 men is fighting for survival in the German forest. At stake, the eastward expansion of the empire.
Varus tried to regroup on the second day, but couldn't communicate with the other section of his army. Arminius had succeeded in splitting the Roman column in 2. This meant that one half of the army would not know whether the other half had survived. Sections of the Roman cavalry, unable to maneuver in the forest, abandoned the infantry and made a dash back to the Rhine.
The survivors managed to hang on through another night. By the morning of the 3rd day, they were exhausted and completely pinned down. Varus and his officers knew that defeat was inevitable, but they also knew that capture meant a horrible death.
You would not have wanted to be a senior centurion who fell into the hands of the Germans. A number of the most senior Romans are wise enough to realize that they are going to have a terrible fate at the enemy's hands. They choose suicide.
For Varus, the humiliation of defeat must have been made 10 times worse for having been duped and betrayed by Arminius.
Varus was a man who I believe would have never even given thought to surrender. The honorable thing for a man in his position to do was to commit suicide. And I mean, what more precedent does he need than his own father had committed suicide, his grandfather had committed suicide? And does one realistically expect that this is a guy who's going to raise the white flag, so to speak, and say, "Hi, here I am, take me hostage"?
After the death of Varus, the resistance of what remained of his 3 legions collapsed. The slaughter that followed horrified Rome. Corpses were cut into pieces, and hundreds of heads and hands nailed to the trees. Those taken prisoner were dragged to ponds deep in the forest, where their throats were cut, and their bodies were thrown in the water as a sacrifice to the forest gods. Afterwards, for years, the forest floor was white with bones. The Germans cut off Varus's head and sent it back to Rome.
That's how they learned that their army had been defeated, is when, not rumor, but Varus's head arrived.
3 entire legions, almost 18,000 men, were dead. Augustus never recovered from the news.
Nightmares. Augustus suffers nightmares with this.
He dismissed his German personal bodyguard. He refused to have a haircut or shave his beard.
Augustus just could not ever quite sleep at night afterwards, and would awaken in the middle of the night yelling, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." The Romans never raised those 3 legions again. They went from 28 legions down to 25 legions, and they didn't expand that army for almost 2 centuries.
But it wasn't just the loss of Augustus's beloved legions. Was the frontier safe? Would the barbarians now stream in to the empire?
The initial response is panic. This is a very good army that's been pulled apart, and it also represents about 10% of Rome's military manpower. So one of the questions is, where are the enemy going to stop?
Conscription was introduced, but when it became clear the Germans were not going to cross the Rhine, the mood turned from fear to humiliation. 6 years later, another army was sent across the Rhine. They discovered the bones of their slaughtered comrades and recovered the eagle standards of the lost legions. But the tribes remained undefeated. Dreams of expansion were over. The empire stopped at the Rhine.
When we look at a number of the other defeats in Roman history, what's interesting with this one is it so very explicitly actually stops a pattern of expansion in one area, and that has very long-lasting consequences. It is also something that actually has a direct impact on the very shape of the Roman Empire.
Because of Teutoburg Forest, the Rhineland became a border between cultures, between those speaking Romance languages like French and Italian, which derive from Latin, and those speaking Germanic languages. Arminius had won a great victory, but he was unable to weld the various German tribes into one single force. 10 years later, he was murdered by some of his own followers. But he became a symbol of German national resistance. Later generations would drop his Latin name and call him Herman.the.German. In 14 AD, Augustus died. In his will, he warned his successor not to make war east of the Rhine. The Romans had suffered a tremendous blow to their confidence. They'd been outwitted by barbarians. The whitened bones of Varus and his soldiers marked the boundary of the Roman Empire.